we'll be using this Open Earth platform. So it's a virtual Earth which kind of tends to embody knowledge in sort of physical models of it. So the key to understanding it is that we've sort of flattened the Earth and we've overlaid time in the direction of height. So you can see here that the philosopher's location in time is located according to this timeline on the right here. So going back to the time period that we're interested in, which is early modern Europe, and let's scroll the timeline down a bit so you can see a bit more of the time period. Okay, so this is kind of what we're looking at. Okay, good. So you can see on the left here some of the key sort of time periods that we're talking about here. The scientific revolution and early modern Europe are going to start around 1500 or so, and it's sort of at the time period that came before that we've talked about a little bit as well. Sort of coming from here is the medieval worldview. The medieval worldview goes all the way down to around 400 or so, when the fall of the Roman Empire takes place. But as you can see, there's quite a few less philosophers around during the Middle Ages, and we'll talk about why that is in a bit. Okay. So the reason I want to go back is that I think in order to sort of understand the early modern era, it's going to be really helpful to sort of understand the contrast to sort of the worldview which it replaced, especially because the early modern period, we still live within sort of the scientific viewpoint that it gave us. So it can be quite hard to sort of actually see that viewpoint because we don't know any alternative. For us, it's just obvious that things are objects and that we're subjects. So in order to sort of see sort of what that theory is about, it's useful to look back and see sort of the medieval worldview, which was then replaced by this early modern period. Okay, so in order to do that, we're going to have a look at sort of some example person. Let's call him Henry. So he's living in, let's say, somewhere in Italy, which was at the time part of the Holy Roman Empire. Let's call him Henri. Okay, good. So let's think about then, how is Henri's worldview different to ours? And we're going to think about this. We're going to think about, what is the difference between what Henri sees when he looks up and sees the stars, and what's the difference between what Henri looks at the Earth and the way that we think about the stars and we think about the Earth. What do we think is the reality of those things? Okay. So then, let's have a look at what Henri sees when he looks up at the stars. Let me quickly change a few things here. Okay, so what this is kind of depicting is that there are 8 spheres, okay, 8 crystal spheres, and each one of those spheres is essentially a rotating sphere. Okay, let's quickly do that. Program a bit. So you see, each sphere is rotating, and each sphere has one of the heavenly bodies attached to it. So, for example, let's try and get the right one. We have this one. This is the sphere of the sun. So let's find where is the sun on this. Somewhere down here. Okay, I'll do it all here as I turn it. Okay. So you can imagine when he looks up and sees these spheres, the fact that they're rotating, that's what's going to explain to him the fact that the sun moves across the Earth. I did hope for as he sees the stars moving over the Earth, as he sees, if you look up and see the night sky over the period of the night, sort of the Milky Way will move over. So all of those rotations for him are explained in terms of looking up and seeing these crystal spheres. Okay, so we've got the crystal spheres. It starts with I think what was it? It's Mercury, then Venus, and then the Sun and the Moon, and then it's a few more planets, and then basically you get the fixed stars. There's some disagreement. Sometimes people think that those fixed stars are actually kind of holes, and it's a great sort of fire heaven behind them, or other people think that they are kind of sort of globes of light or discs of light, and there's some disagreements about that. The key idea, though, is that on this picture of the crystal spheres, is that there's also a notion of outside the crystal spheres. So that's when we hit sort of the heaven, basically, And heaven is this a totally different realm than the earth in the crystal spheres, and that's sort of where God's hand reaches down. Okay, and the key reason this is important is that on the medieval worldview, there's sort of two kinds of thing in the world. Okay, remember we've talked about the fact that for Descartes there's two kinds of thing, and it's subjects and it's objects. But before that, there was a different picture of those two kinds of things, and that picture was that on the one hand there's God, and on the other hand there's everything else. Okay, so God is the absolute creator of everything in the universe, and that means that everything in the universe has a particular name. It's called ens creatum. They are all created things. That's Latin for created things. Okay, why does this matter? So let's have a think now about what Henry sees when he sees the earth. So if we go back to our picture of Henri, and let's actually get rid of some of these philosophers so you can see what's going on. Or maybe I can't do that. I can't do that, so I'm just going to ignore it. Problems with the technology, guys. It's not perfect yet. Okay, good. Okay, so anyway, we're going back to look at Henri and think about what is he seeing when he sees the earth. So when he looks around and he sees the rocks, when he looks around and he sees the trees, what is it that he sort of understands himself to be seeing? Okay, so when he sees those things, what he sees is that their fundamental nature is how they get their place in God's plan. Okay, if I want to know what the essence of a line is, then what I should do is think about what is the place of the line in God's plan. And as a contrast, just for example, if we want to know what the essence of a line was, we think, well, we have to go to biology, we have to look at its DNA, we have to look at its habitat. None of that would be the case for Henri. What he would think is, what does the Bible say about the lion? What aspect of God's plan is revealed by the fact that he's created this lion? And as we'll see later, sort of the position of the lion in the sort of at the top of the apex is kind of relates the lion to the king. Okay, so in some ways, by creating the lion, God is sending us a message that we can read, that it is proper and good that there be some king in power ruling over the others. So the essence of a lion is not just like its own essence, but like what does it mean for human life? Because of course it has a role in God's plan and a role in God's plan for human life. Okay, before we move on and look at that in more detail, let's have a look at another illustration. Let's have a look back now at the map in a bit more detail. So if we think about the sort of map, let's pull out and have a look at the sort of original version. So this is the original version before I sort of made it into a globe. Okay, so let's have a look at what it shows us. Okay, so the first thing to notice here is that, let me just quote the person who said it better than I'm going to. What mattered most to Europeans who drew the medieval map. So one thing to notice is that Jerusalem is the centre of the earth. Okay, and it's not that these people didn't get that Jerusalem possibly wasn't the centre of the earth. It's just they didn't even think in those ways. There's no attempt at measurement here. There's no attempt to get the relative size right. The earth isn't at the top, the north isn't the top, it's east which is the top. It's where the sun rises, which is sort of where you orientate yourself to. And of course where the sun rises is then identified with the light of Christ. So what you notice is that sort of the moral and the sort of spiritual metaphysics is sort of overlain on the sort of the normal world. And what's totally absent is any sort of abstract mathematical attempt to understand the world. Okay, so to quote experts in this one, what mattered most to Europeans who drew the medieval mappa mundi and cinema maps was not to depict the exact shape of countries, continents and oceans, to present the known world as a unity seen through a biblical lens. A Christian medieval map was not only a graphic depiction of what mapmakers knew about the world, but also an image of the world in which what mattered most was not geography but salvation. The Mappa Mundi was meant to assist those who saw it in their pilgrimage towards the heavenly Jerusalem. Thus Jerusalem is placed at the centre, but it's here that history's most decisive event occurred. After all, what was so significant as Christ's victory over death? The resurrection made Jerusalem the centre of all centre points. Okay, so that is basically an overview of the Christian understanding of the world, the medieval understanding of the world. One way out which I think we can sort of see this as well is by thinking about some of the plays of William Shakespeare. Let me quickly bring back the map here. Okay, so when you did your GCSE English classes, you might have heard when you talked about Shakespeare the idea that he's kind of a transitional figure. But because before him, sort of during the medieval times, the way that you sort of understood the world and the way you sort of understood society was in terms of the great chain of being. Okay, where is Shakespeare? There we go. Okay, so Shakespeare's writing, you can see sort of a contemporary of Francis Bacon, and he's writing just a little bit before the birth of Descartes. Okay. So one of the themes in Shakespeare's plays is that the sort of idea of the great chain of being is slowly fading away. But he still has it in some of his plays, and we can see it here. We're going to look at a little quote from one of his plays, Macbeth. And I want you to think about, when we read this quote, is how does this illustrate the idea of the great chain of being? And there's probably three examples of sort of, kind of disorder that reflects the fact that Macbeth has just killed the King Macduff. Once you've found those three examples, what we're going to think about is, as an extension, is how does the plot of Macbeth itself indicate that sort of maybe the great chain of being is sort of losing its grip on people's way of life. Okay, now let's move on and have a look at the early modern period. So what happens when Mr. Descartes here, who's born in, when was he born? He's apparently born in just sort of 16, that's probably 1550 or something like that. We're going to see. He's born in around 1596, that makes sense. Okay, okay, so we have to remember that the dominant worldview at the time is that of the Ptolemaic system. Okay, that's the one I showed you with all the crystal spheres. Okay, and then this is going to get replaced by the Copernican system, as we know that from Descartes. Sorry, Descartes, that's from Copernicus, but then to some degree confirmed by Descartes. Let me just put the orbits on, and you can see that better. And we can get the planets moving as well. Okay, so the system that Descartes has brought us is something like this one. Okay, the one we're all familiar with, the solar system. Of course, it's rather simplified in terms of the orbits and the positions, but this is roughly speaking the picture that that Galileo is going to use to replace the idea of the crystal sphere. So when you look up at the night sky, the key thing to notice here is that it's no longer a different space. Okay, when the medieval person looked up, what they saw was like there was the stars, and then behind that there was a whole new realm, that of the heavens. Okay, but for Galileo, when he looks up at the stars, that's a unified space. Okay, so the same space that he's in is also the space that the stars are in, and further and further and further. And that space is not only uniform, but it's sort of the movement of the bodies in that space is also a uniform thing. And as he predicts, and is not quite yet able to prove, is that within that space, bodies are governed by uniform law. Okay, so Galileo is the one who sort of discovers the proper orbits of the planets, discovers the structure of the solar system, and then it's a little bit later that Isaac Newton comes along and writes Principia Mathematica, and there he gives the actual formula for gravity and shows that this simple formula can generate all of the orbits which are observed. So we know that not only is sort of space a totally unified, uniform space, but that uniform space is universally governed by scientific physical laws. And this is essentially the heart of the revolution that's taken place. We can also see that if we look at the Earth that's sort of shown here. So if you look at the Earth here, let's pause the rotation for a moment. And that's actually going to be this one. I'm going to read it away from you. So this is a map due to a man called Mercature. You might know the name because that's the name that we give to a lot of our maps. They're Mercature maps. He's sort of the first man to come up with basically an idea of how to sort of properly mathematically deal with measuring a globe in a way that makes sense, that you can transfer naturally into 2 dimensions. And Mercature is also hugely influential because he's basically the guy who comes up with the first map that Christopher Columbus used. So one of the ways which you can understand what's happened is that from a medieval point of view, the maps were like they had these blank spaces where you said, "Oh, there are monsters there," or "God doesn't want you to go there," or "That's the centre of God's creation." But once you get this sort of much more mathematical understanding of the world, then those blank spaces become something to be explored. They become places that you can go, and of course that's with the benefit of the Mercature map. Christopher Columbus sets off into the west in the hopes, he thinks, to essentially hit India. Of course, it turns out that there was America in the way. Okay, good. So the last thing that we're going to think about then is the effects that this sort of changing view of the universe had for the view that people had around knowledge. Okay, one thing, let's go with this one. And go to another one. Okay, so the way we're going to sort of explore this is by looking at another play. This is a play by a German playwright called Bertolt Brecht. So Brecht wrote a wonderful play I can really highly recommend, which is about the life of Galileo. And the scene we're going to sort of talk through, and we'll act out a little bit, is a scene from this play. And what's going on in this scene is that Galileo has got into a bit of trouble. The reason he's got into trouble is that his system, as we saw, it seems to conflict with the system that the church has sort of ever used, and they're pretty unhappy about this, and they want him to to deal with it. So he's invited all of these sort of court astronomers, not astronomers, but sort of court mathematician and a court philosopher, and they kind of represent this sort of old knowledge that you had on the medieval worldview. All this knowledge that comes from Aristotle, it comes from the Bible. If you want knowledge, that's where to go to. You go to the tradition. Okay, so Galileo has persuaded them that the way to sort this out was for them to come around and have a look through the telescope, and in the telescope they would see that he'd discovered that there are 5 moons orbiting Jupiter. They were called stars at the time. So he'd called them Medicean stars. He'd named them after like the ruler of the city, who was a Medici, an old Italian ruling family. So he's trying to get on their good books by calling the stars after them. So the guys have come round, and Galileo is just there saying, "Guys, just have a look through the telescope. You're going to see those stars. It's going to show you that crystal spheres don't exist." And that's the setup, and we'll see what happens as we read the play. So this is sort of a little representation of Galileo's study, and we have a sort of few pictures for a representation of the different people involved in the conversation. So that's Galileo. Let's say this is the mathematician, and this is going to be the philosopher. Both of whom are not good guys. Okay, so now that's it. We'll pause there, and you can read. Okay, so the answer basically to this is that there's a few key ways in which this scene illustrates the idea that it illustrates the conflict between different ideas about what the source of knowledge is. So for Galileo, the source of knowledge is the empirical observation of reality. You look through the telescope, and the key contrast is with the philosopher and mathematician who think that Aristotle and proper logical disputation and sort of abstract reasoning is the source of knowledge. So you can see also that Brecht has kind of included some of the conflicts between rationalism and empiricism in this as well, with Galileo on the empiricist side. Okay, so for the astronomers, or the philosophers and the mathematicians here, the church is the source of knowledge. The wisdom of Aristotle, as interpreted by the church, is the source of knowledge, because knowledge doesn't have value for its own sake. Knowledge is only valuable insofar as it leads soul to salvation. Okay, so again we see that similar to the map. What fundamentally matters is salvation, sort of knowledge and truth for its own sake is not essentially valuable. Okay. Another thing to notice is that for Galileo, knowledge is a matter of individual reason. Okay, whereas for the philosopher and mathematician, knowledge is essentially a social thing. It's something that is determined by the magisterium, which is like a bunch of the Pope and a few cardinals together. It's to be gained by looking at sort of what the old classical authors have said. What does Aristotle, the great authority, say? That's how we gain knowledge. Okay, so the last way in which Galileo has a sort of different view about where knowledge comes from, although this is slightly, I think, imported by Brecht, is the fact that he talks about the fact that it's the dock workers down, sort of who make things with their hands, who do kind of experiments. They're the ones who kind of have knowledge and should be paid attention to. Whereas these two are like, a man who doesn't speak Latin, who hasn't read his Greek, what a waste of my time. Why would I talk to him? There's also this sense of sort of where does knowledge come from in terms of what kind of things should you pay attention to. Okay, so although it may not seem like it to us, a lot of this is contained in the first line of Descartes' Meditations. So when he says that he will, trust his own reason, he's not going to go by, things he's been taught. It's very sort of subtle, but he's basically saying that, everything that he was taught, all of the opinions of the church and people like that are suspect, and he's going to choose himself to find out what the truth is. Okay. So, last thing to say about this one is the sort of some sort of 100 years or so ago later, we get sort of the final and the best articulation of what the Enlightenment really is. So, if we can skim over to a man we've come across before, that is Immanuel Kant. A little bit smaller. So Immanuel Kant is up here, so he's living sort of just in the period of Enlightenment which developed out of the early modern period. And he said the following. I'll give it the German and then translate. Aufklärung ist die Ausgang as mentioned aus seiner selbstverschuldeter Unmündigkeit. So it's the idea that enlightenment is the departure of the humans from their immaturity. Okay, and what is immaturity? It's the inability to make use of your own understanding without direction from another. And this is a self-incurred, it's only our own fault that we're still children, because we lack the courage to make use of our own reason. And it says, "Sei beade," and that's Latin for "dare to be wise." Finally, "Habe Mut, dich deines eigenes Verstandes zu bedienen," ist also der Wahlspruch der Aufklärung. Have courage to make use of your own understanding is the motto of the Enlightenment. Okay, one last thing to say is that it can sound from this as though the Enlightenment and the early modern people, or certainly definitely not the early modern people, were all atheists. And that's very anachronistic. That's of our understanding. That's totally not the case. Probably the first one you could actually call an atheist is this guy David Hume, and he's only comes along in sort of 1700s or so. Okay, so for this whole period, Voltaire maybe as well. But certainly for Locke, for Pascal, for Descartes, for basically all the modern people, as also for Leibniz, they had no doubt that God exists. What's changed is how they think about God. So let's have a quick look at one more picture here. So if we go back to the Copernican worldview. Okay, so the picture they have now is that, and let's get rid of some of these things one moment. Let's just go. Okay, well that's going to have to do. Okay, so what is going on here? So the key thing to get here is that although we now have a globe and we have the solar system rotating, so let's quickly go back to that. Okay, so we have at the center we have the sun, and we have all the planets, and then basically Galileo's picture is that all the stars are sort of suns, and he thinks that they're sort of in some big universe. They're not exactly sure how big. Okay? But this doesn't write God out, okay? Because what the kind of picture you develop from that is a kind of a clockwork universe. It's much bigger than it was before, but still sort of in some sense outside of this clockwork universe, you could think that there is a God there. Okay? So what's changed now is that the picture that we have, let's quickly get a bit back to our writing 1 second. So here is that we have two basic things that exist in the world. We have subjects and we have objects. Okay, and so the subjects on the one hand include God, who becomes a sort of super subject, and then we have on the other hand humans, who are sort of thinking selves or res cogitans or souls or minds, pretty much equivalent. And the other hand there are res extens, which are all the objects in the world and in the universe. Okay, so what has happened here is that overall transition is from a universe where the two things that exist are that God and all the things it creates, to a universe where all the things that exist are subjects, which include gods and humans, and objects. Okay, that is it for today.